This is Dr. Kraus, and this is the fifth of our little videos on the Festal scrolls, and this is for the last one as they appear in the Bible, the book of Lamentations. It isn't the last one written, that's probably Esther. The book of Lamentations remembers the horrors of the siege of Jerusalem in 586 or 587 BC that resulted in the final destruction of the city and the destruction of the Temple of Solomon. In the Jewish tradition, Lamentations is read on the 9th day of Av, the month in the Jewish calendar of Av, and this usually is in the summer, would be in July or August for us. That day, it's read to remember both destructions of the temple, this one that we mentioned by the Babylonians in 586 BC, and by the Romans after the time of Jesus in AD 70. This is a very solemn, sad day of remembrance for Jewish people, and the 9th of Av is thought to be the date of the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. This is why they choose this day. The name of the book in Hebrew is Aikah, which is just the first word of Lamentations. It means how, and really is a fitting name. How did this happen? And to some degree it has the same perspective that we saw in Kings and Samuel. How did this happen? Why did this happen? That's really the perspective of Lamentations. So it's after the destruction, it's sort of pre-exilic, before they really get into the exile. In the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, this book is labeled the Threnoi, or Thrani, the dirges, meaning the sad songs. The author of the book, Lamentations, has traditionally been seen as written by Jeremiah, and in the Septuagint even has an extra verse at the beginning that explains some of supposedly the circumstance behind Jeremiah's writing. So that's the traditional author. Today some scholars believe it is a collection more of poems written by different authors. Close study kind of shows it's not all the same person writing all 5 of these poems. And at any rate, the very vivid recollections and descriptions of the poems place them soon after the destruction of Jerusalem by eyewitnesses. And Jeremiah would be a possibility for that, certainly. So we would probably want to think that there's some connection between this book, these poems, and Jeremiah the prophet. The form is very interesting. Each chapter of Lamentations is a separate poem, so there are 5 separate Lamentations. The plural is appropriate here. It is a collection then, rather than a narrative or a discourse. And in that, it's even more like the book of Psalms. It's sort of like this specialized collection of lament psalms. The first 4 of the chapter or poems are acrostics, and that means that each line begins with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet in order. So Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and so forth, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. This would be like if we did a poem in English, and it first line began with A, and then second line with B, and third line with C, and so forth. And that's especially seen in chapter 3, which actually has 66 rather than 22 verses, the third of the Lamentations. So what happens there is that there are 3 lines that begin with each letter. So the first 3 lines begin with Aleph, then the second 3 lines begin with Beit, and the third 3 lines with Gimel, and so forth. So 66 total. The 5th chapter also has 22 verses, but it's not an acrostic, and so apparently the author wanted the 22 verses but didn't think it was necessary to do it as an acrostic. And we've talked about this before, but acrostic is a memory technique. So it was designed to help people memorize these poems. You would click off each verse and know that each one would begin with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. What is the content? Well, the poems describe the horror and the despair of those who were in Jerusalem at the time of the siege. The residents were starving to death, and the depths of depravity were reached when we read in the poem in chapter 2 that mothers were even cooking and eating their own children. So about as bad as you can get is cannibalism, especially cannibalism of your own children. So the slaughter of the priests and the prophets are described in the temple. This is particularly disturbing to the authors. Theologically, though, there is a recognition that this is a national catastrophe that was caused by the unfaithfulness of the people. They do sort of get it in the poems. So the Lord himself is behind what happens, and they know that. The Lord, Jehovah God, is withdrawing his blessings and also facilitating the Babylonians, and so they are powerless to do much about this. The object that I have for Lamentations is a pair of baby shoes, and Lamentations 3:22 and 23, those two verses, lift up the idea of the newness of God's mercy. And so to illustrate this, the idea of a new human being, a baby, and just symbolize that by baby shoes. So baby shoes, something new. It's the glimmer of hope, this passage in Lamentations. So let's take a look at this in a little more detail, this one passage, and we'll expand it a little bit. Lamentations chapter 3, beginning with verse 19. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. I just might say the way I memorized that years ago, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. And then verse 23, they are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. So the theme word is new, symbolized by baby shoes, and you see this idea in verse 23, the steadfast love of the Lord, his mercies, they are new every morning. Every morning is a new day with the potential of God's blessing. And this word translated in the NIV, the Lord's great love, is our famous word we've talked about many times, chesed, this covenant love of Yahweh. It's been translated here as steadfast love, as I mentioned. Here, the Lord's great love. In the midst of utter calamity, then, the author is sure of these things. This is what we take away from this verse. This is probably about the only place in the book that is preachable, I think, unless you have a congregation that really wants to study this book. But this passage that we're looking at, three things here. Number one, God remains merciful and compassionate. So even though everything is falling apart around him, he's convinced that God is still merciful, God is still compassionate. And secondly, that God remains faithful to his covenant. And this is kind of the same thing. It's not really disconnected, but God is faithful. God is the one, the God of covenant love, of chesed, but God remains faithful to the covenant. So you get this fabulous line, great is your faithfulness, the old hymn based on this, great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. And third, though, in this text, the theological conclusion is that we must sometimes trust the Lord and wait for his mercies to resume. So in the end, he says, therefore I will wait for him. So we mentioned this a little bit before, that in the complaint of Jeremiah and Habakkuk, why do the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper? Not quite the question here, because there's a recognition that they're all wicked and they're being punished. But at the same time, one of the answers that we get in the Old Testament is that we are called to wait on the Lord. And this is really the answer here of Lamentations.